Brothers and sisters, what I'm about to tell you today isn't just a testimony, it's a warning, a promise, and a revelation that will shatter every doubt you've ever carried about the power of our living God. My hands still tremble as I speak these words, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of having witnessed the impossible made manifest before my very eyes. My name is Marcus Chen, and until 3 months ago I was nothing more than a documentary filmmaker with a cynical heart and a camera that had captured more human suffering than miracles. At 34 years old, I had built my career on exposing religious fraud, debunking so-called supernatural phenomena, and revealing the dark underbelly of faith-based movements around the world. I wore my skepticism like armor, convinced that every miracle had an explanation, every healing had been staged, and every divine intervention was nothing more than coincidence dressed up in religious language. But God, oh God, had other plans for me. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. I was sitting in my cluttered apartment in Bangkok, editing footage from my latest project, another exposé on prosperity preachers, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was that of Dr. Sarah Martinez, a colleague from my journalism days who had since become a missionary doctor in Myanmar. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice crackling through what was obviously a poor connection, "I need you to come here. There's something happening, something you need to document." I laughed, not kindly. "Sarah, if this is about another supposed miracle healing, save your breath. I'm not interested in filming your religious theater." There was something in her silence that made me pause. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a weight I had never heard before. "Marcus, they're going to kill a man tomorrow. They're going to crucify him, and he's asking for it." The line went dead. For the next 6 hours, I couldn't shake the image her words had painted in my mind. Crucifixion, in 2024. It seemed impossible, barbaric, unthinkable. But something in Sarah's voice, a trembling certainty that chilled me to the bone, made me book the next flight to Yangon. The journey to Myanmar felt like traveling backwards through time itself. As my plane descended through the monsoon clouds, I could see the golden spires of ancient pagodas rising like prayers from the emerald landscape below. But I also saw something else, columns of black smoke rising from what Sarah later told me were burning churches, evidence of the persecution that had been systematically erasing Christian communities from this Buddhist-majority nation. Sarah met me at the airport and I barely recognized her. The vibrant woman I had known in college was now gaunt, her eyes holding depths of sorrow and something else, something that looked dangerously close to hope. As we drove through the chaotic streets of Yangon, she began to tell me about Pastor David Kim, a Korean missionary who had been ministering to the underground Christian community in the northern provinces. "He appeared 6 months ago," she said, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "No one knows exactly where he came from, but the communities he touches, Marcus, they're being transformed. Addicts are being healed, families reconciled, the blind are seeing. But the local authorities, the Buddhist extremists, they've had enough." She paused to navigate around a convoy of military trucks, their occupants watching us with hard eyes. 3 days ago, they arrested him. They've given him a choice: renounce his faith publicly and leave the country, or face execution by crucifixion as an example to other Christians. "And he chose?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He chose the cross." The 2-day journey to the remote village where Pastor Kim was being held felt like a pilgrimage through purgatory. We traveled in an old jeep along roads that were little more than mud tracks carved through dense jungle. Sarah's local contacts, a network of underground Christians who communicated through coded text messages and hand signals, guided us through military checkpoints with a combination of forged papers and what could only be described as divine favor. As we climbed into the mountains, the air grew thinner and charged with an electricity I couldn't explain. Sarah told me more about Pastor Kim, how he had arrived speaking perfect Burmese despite being Korean, how he seemed to know intimate details about people's lives before meeting them, how his presence brought both inexplicable peace and intense spiritual warfare. "The children love him," she said, as we bumped along a particularly rough stretch of road. "There's this little girl, Grace, maybe 7 years old. She started having visions after Pastor Kim arrived. She draws pictures of angels and speaks in languages she's never learned. Yesterday, she told her mother that tomorrow would be the day heaven comes to earth." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. We arrived in the village of Tantlang just as the sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The village was small, maybe 300 people living in bamboo houses clustered around a dirt square. But what struck me immediately was the atmosphere. Despite the fear that should have hung over a community about to witness an execution, there was something else present. It felt like anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the very air holds its breath. The villagers gathered around us as Sarah introduced me, their faces a mixture of curiosity and wariness. But it was the children who drew my attention. They seemed to move with an unusual purposefulness, their eyes bright with something I couldn't identify. And then I saw her, Grace. She was tiny, even for 7, with the kind of face that belonged in Renaissance paintings of cherubim. But her eyes held depths that seemed impossible for someone so young. When she looked at me, I felt as though she was seeing through me, past my cynicism and skepticism, straight to something I didn't even know existed within myself. "You came to see," she said in perfect English, though Sarah had told me she only spoke Chin and Burmese. "You came to tell the world." Before I could respond, she took my hand with the casual confidence of a child and led me toward a small bamboo church at the edge of the village. "Pastor Kim is praying," she said simply. "He asked Jesus to send someone to record what happens tomorrow. Jesus sent you." The church was little more than a frame covered with woven bamboo mats, but stepping inside felt like entering a cathedral. The space was filled with villagers, their voices raised in what I later learned was an ancient Chin hymn. The harmonies seemed to vibrate through my chest, and I found myself struggling to breathe normally. At the front of the church, kneeling before a simple wooden cross, was Pastor Kim. He was not what I had expected. Where I had imagined a larger-than-life figure, I found a man of average height with gentle features and graying hair. But there was something about his presence that commanded attention without demanding it. As he prayed, his lips moving silently, the very air around him seemed to shimmer. When he finally stood and turned to face the congregation, his eyes found mine immediately. In that moment, I felt something I had never experienced before. The sensation of being truly seen, not just observed, but seen in a way that was both terrifying and comforting. He approached me with slow, deliberate steps, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made my knees weak. "Brother Marcus," he said, and somehow I wasn't surprised that he knew my name. "Thank you for coming. Tomorrow, you will see the glory of God revealed in ways that will change your life forever. Are you ready?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to run back to Bangkok, back to my apartment, back to my safe world of skepticism and controlled narratives. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I'm here." Pastor Kim smiled, and in that smile, I saw something that made my chest tight. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what was coming and had chosen to walk toward it anyway. The night passed in a blur of prayer and preparation. The village Christians gathered in homes and hidden corners, their voices raised in songs I didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar. Grace appeared at my side repeatedly throughout the evening, offering me cups of tea and making observations that chilled me with their accuracy. "The soldiers will come at sunrise," she told me, as I sat in Sarah's borrowed sleeping bag, trying unsuccessfully to rest. "They will be angry because they expected us to be afraid, but we're not afraid anymore." "Why aren't you afraid?" I asked, genuinely curious. She looked at me with those impossibly ancient eyes. "Because Pastor Kim taught us that fear is just forgetting who God is, and tomorrow everyone will remember." Dawn came with the sound of truck engines and marching boots. I grabbed my camera equipment and followed Sarah and Grace toward the village square, where a crowd was already gathering. The sight that greeted me there will be burned into my memory until my dying day. A squad of 20 soldiers in full military gear had surrounded the square, their automatic weapons clearly visible. Behind them stood a group of Buddhist monks in saffron robes, their faces set in expressions of righteous determination. And in the center of the square, they had erected a wooden cross. It was crude but sturdy, made from local timber and rising nearly 10 feet into the morning air. At its base, they had piled kindling and what looked like gasoline-soaked rags. The message was clear. This would not be a simple crucifixion. They intended to burn him alive. The commanding officer, a colonel whose uniform bore the stains of what I hoped was mud, stood before the assembled villagers with a megaphone. When he spoke, his voice echoed off the surrounding mountains like thunder. "People of Thantlang, he announced in Burmese, which Sarah translated in whispers for my benefit. Today you will witness the fate of those who bring foreign superstitions to our sacred land. Let this be a lesson to any who would corrupt our children with lies about false gods. But as he spoke, something remarkable was happening among the villagers. Instead of the fear and submission the soldiers clearly expected, I saw people joining hands. Children moved to stand beside their parents. The elderly stepped forward rather than back. And through it all I could hear the sound of quiet singing. It started with just a few voices, but within minutes the entire crowd of villagers was singing. It was the same hymn I had heard in the church the night before, but now it rose from hundreds of throats, creating harmonies that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. The colonel's expression shifted from confidence to irritation to something approaching alarm. He barked orders to his soldiers, who moved to disperse the crowd, but the villagers simply knelt where they stood, their voices never wavering. That's when Pastor Kim appeared. He walked out of the small bamboo church flanked by 2 guards, his hands bound behind his back, but his posture was erect, his face peaceful, and as he moved through the crowd of kneeling villagers, many reached out to touch the hem of his simple white robe. When he reached the cross, the colonel approached him with the megaphone. "Kim David," he announced using the Korean naming convention, "you have been found guilty of sedition, corruption of minors, and practicing illegal religious activities. You have been sentenced to death by crucifixion. Do you have any final words?" Pastor Kim looked out over the gathered crowd, his eyes moving from face to face, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the square without amplification. "I have lived to see this day," he said in perfect Burmese, "and you, my friends, will live to tell your children and your children's children about what you witness here. Today, heaven comes to earth." The soldiers moved with mechanical efficiency, forcing Pastor Kim to the ground and beginning the grisly process of nailing him to the cross. I raised my camera, my hands shaking as I tried to document what was happening, but part of me wanted to turn away, to close my eyes, to be anywhere but there. But Grace appeared beside me again, her small hand slipping into mine. "Watch," she whispered. "Don't look away. This is why you came." The sound of the hammer striking the nails will haunt me forever, not because it was brutal, though it was, but because with each blow Pastor Kim's voice rose in prayer, not for himself, but for his executioners. "Father," he prayed as they nailed his right hand, "forgive them." "Father," he continued as they secured his left hand, "they don't understand what they're doing." "Father," he finished as they nailed his feet, "show them your glory." When they raised the cross, the sound of the villagers singing grew even louder, but now it was joined by something else, a sound I couldn't identify at first, like wind rushing through trees, except there was no wind. The morning air had become perfectly still. The colonel stepped forward again, a burning torch in his hand. "Any last words, false prophet?" Pastor Kim looked down at him, and when he spoke, his voice was somehow stronger despite his obvious pain. "Colonel Thant," he said, and I saw the officer's face go white. "Your mother prays for you every night. She lights incense before the statue of Buddha and asks that her son's heart be softened. But Buddha cannot hear her prayers. Today, the God who does hear them will show you mercy." The colonel stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. How do you know my mother's name? How do you know about her prayers?" Pastor Kim smiled, and blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. "Because the God I serve knows all things, loves all people, and has a plan even for this moment." That's when the colonel lost control. With a roar of rage and what might have been fear, he thrust the torch toward the kindling at the base of the cross. The gasoline-soaked rags caught immediately, and flames began to lick upward toward Pastor Kim's feet. But something was wrong. The flames, which should have spread rapidly up the cross, seemed to stop just short of Pastor Kim's body. They danced and flickered around him, creating an almost perfect circle, but they would not touch him. The colonel thrust the torch again and again at the wooden cross, but though the kindling burned fiercely, the cross itself remained untouched. Murmurs of confusion began to ripple through the crowd of soldiers and monks. Some of the villagers began to stand, their singing growing louder, more confident. And that's when I noticed something that made my hands shake so violently, I almost dropped my camera. The sky was changing. What had been a clear morning was now filled with clouds that seemed to be forming out of nothing, swirling in patterns that defied meteorology. And the light was wrong. It was still morning, But the quality of illumination was shifting, becoming richer, more golden, as if the sun itself was moving closer to the earth. "Do you see it?" Grace whispered beside me, her voice filled with wonder. "Do you see them coming?" I looked where she was pointing, up into the swirling clouds, and I saw something that made my rational mind simply shut down. Shapes were moving in the clouds, large, luminous forms that seemed to pulse with their own light. At first I thought they might be aircraft, but as they drew closer, I realized they were something else entirely. They were wings. Massive, brilliant wings that caught and reflected the golden light, and as they descended, I could make out forms, tall, powerful figures dressed in what looked like light itself. The villagers were pointing now, their voices raised not in song, but in shouts of joy and wonder. The soldiers had noticed too. Several of them had lowered their weapons and were staring upward with expressions of confusion and growing fear. The Buddhist monks were backing away from the square, their faces pale with shock. But Pastor Kim, hanging on the cross with flames dancing harmlessly around his feet, was looking up at the approaching figures with an expression of pure joy. "Welcome, brothers," he called out, his voice somehow audible above the growing commotion. Right on time. That's when the first of the beings touched down in the square. I have no adequate words to describe what I saw. The figure that landed just a few feet from the cross was easily 8 feet tall, with features that were undeniably masculine but beautiful in a way that transcended human categories. His skin seemed to emit its own light, and his eyes were like flames, but flames that warmed rather than burned. He was wearing what looked like armor, but armor made of light and something that might have been crystal. In his hand he carried a sword that hummed with energy, and when he spoke, his voice resonated through the square like the sound of many waters. "Peace," he said, and the word itself seemed to carry weight, pressing down on everyone present, until even the most aggressive soldier found himself lowering his weapon. "Be still and know that he is God." More of the beings were landing now, surrounding the cross in a loose circle. I counted 12 of them, each one unique but sharing that same quality of otherworldly presence. The villagers had fallen to their knees, but their faces showed no fear, only awe and worship. The soldiers, however, were beginning to panic. Several of them were trying to radio for backup, others were attempting to flee, and a few of the braver ones were raising their weapons toward the luminous figures. The colonel, his face now purple with rage and terror, was screaming orders that no one seemed to hear. "Shoot them," he commanded. "Shoot them all." But when the soldiers tried to fire their weapons, nothing happened. They pulled triggers, worked bolts, and checked ammunition, but their guns had simply stopped functioning. Not broken, not jammed, just silent. One of the luminous beings approached the colonel, moving with a grace that made me think of water flowing uphill. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, but carried an authority that made my bones ache. "Colonel Aung Tant," he said, using the officer's full name, "your time of choosing has come. Will you continue to fight against the one who loves you, or will you accept the mercy he offers?" The colonel backed away, his face contorting with confusion and fear. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This is some kind of trick, some technology." But the being simply smiled and gestured toward Pastor Kim, still hanging on the cross. "Look at the one you sought to kill, and see what love looks like." I turned my camera toward Pastor Kim, and what I saw through the lens made me gasp. The flames that had been dancing around the base of the cross were now rising up around his entire body, but instead of burning him, they seemed to be healing him. The wounds from the nails were closing, the blood was disappearing, and his face was radiant with a light that rivaled the beings surrounding him. "Father," Pastor Kim said, his voice now strong and clear, "they are ready to see." And that's when the impossible happened. The nails that had been driven through Pastor Kim's hands and feet simply fell away, clattering to the ground below. The ropes that had bound him to the cross loosened and dropped, and Pastor Kim, who should have been dying or dead, stepped down from the cross as easily as stepping off a curb. But he didn't just step down. He floated. His feet touched the ground gently, and as he stood in the center of the square, surrounded by the luminous beings, his own body began to emit the same warm, golden light. The effect on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. The villagers rose to their feet, their hands raised in worship, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to make the very air sing. But it was the effect on the soldiers and monks that truly shocked me. One by one they began to fall to their knees, not in defeat but in recognition. The hardened military officers who had come to oversee an execution were weeping like children. The Buddhist monks who had demanded Pastor Kim's death were removing their robes and casting them aside. And Colonel Thant was crawling across the ground toward Pastor Kim, his face streaked with tears. "Forgive me," he sobbed. "Oh God, forgive me. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Pastor Kim knelt beside the colonel, placing his hands on the man's head. When he spoke, his voice carried love so pure it was almost tangible. "You are forgiven, brother. You have always been forgiven. The question is, will you accept it?" What happened next defied every natural law I thought I understood. As Pastor Kim prayed over Colonel Thant, a visible change began to occur in the military officer. The lines of cruelty and hardness that had marked his face for years began to soften. His eyes, which had been cold and calculating, filled with a warmth that transformed his entire appearance, and when he looked up at Pastor Kim, he was no longer the same man. "I believe," he whispered. "I don't understand it, but I believe." The transformation spread through the gathered soldiers like wildfire. Men who had come to commit murder were embracing the villagers they had intended to terrorize. Weapons were being cast aside. One young sergeant, tears streaming down his face, was asking Sarah how he could be baptized, but it was one of the Buddhist monks who provided the moment that will stay with me forever. An elderly man who had been among the most vocal in demanding Pastor Kim's execution approached the cross, still standing in the center of the square. He looked up at it for a long moment, then turned to Pastor Kim. "I have spent 60 years seeking enlightenment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have meditated in caves, fasted until my body was nothing but bones, memorized thousands of sutras, but I have never felt the peace that radiates from you. How is this possible?" Pastor Kim smiled and took the old monk's hands in his own. "Venerable Father," he said with deep respect, "you have been seeking truth your entire life. Today, truth has come to seek you." The monk's knees buckled, and he fell prostrate before Pastor Kim. "Teach me," he pleaded. "Teach me about this Jesus." What followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed or even imagined. The luminous beings, who had remained silently watching the interactions between Pastor Kim and the soldiers, began to move through the crowd. They approached individuals, some villagers, some soldiers, some monks, and spoke to them in voices too low for me to hear. But whatever they said had profound effects. I watched a hardened sergeant embrace the child whose father he had killed in a raid the previous month. I saw a young monk take off his prayer beads and place them around the neck of a Christian grandmother, asking for her prayers. I witnessed Colonel Thant, still weeping, pulling out his satellite phone and calling his commanders to report that the operation was being cancelled. But perhaps most remarkably, I watched Grace approach one of the luminous beings, the one who had first spoken to the colonel. She looked up at him without fear and spoke in that same perfectly clear English. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. The being knelt down to her level, his massive form somehow becoming gentle and approachable. "We go where we are sent," he replied. "But the one we serve never leaves." Grace nodded solemnly, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small drawing. It was crayon on paper, clearly the work of a child, but when she held it up I could see it was a remarkably accurate depiction of what was happening around us. The cross, the luminous beings, Pastor Kim, glowing with light. "I drew this 3 days ago," she told the being. "Jesus showed me in a dream." The being took the drawing with reverent care, studying it closely. When he looked back at Grace, something like wonder crossed his luminous features. "Little prophet," he said softly, "your faith has moved heaven itself." As the morning progressed, the transformation of the entire situation became complete. The military vehicles that had brought the execution squad were now being used to ferry wounded villagers to the medical clinic Sarah had established. The soldiers who had come as persecutors were helping to rebuild homes that had been damaged in previous raids. The Buddhist monks who had demanded Pastor Kim's death were sitting in circles with Christian villagers, engaged in deep theological discussions, and Pastor Kim moved through it all like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of reconciliation. He prayed with former enemies, comforted those who wept with remorse, and spoke words of forgiveness that seemed to lift burdens from souls that had carried them for years. But it was late in the afternoon when the most profound moment occurred. I was filming Pastor Kim as he spoke with a group of young soldiers, when suddenly he stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at me. "Brother Marcus," he called out, and once again, every eye in the square turned toward me. "Come." I approached him on shaking legs, my camera still rolling out of habit more than conscious decision. When I reached him, he placed his hands on my shoulders and looked into my eyes with an intensity that made me want to hide. "You came here as a skeptic," he said, and his words carried across the square clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You have built your life on doubt, on the safety of disbelief. But what have you seen today?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. How could I explain what I had witnessed? How could I rationalize angels walking on earth, crosses that wouldn't burn, nails falling away from healed flesh, enemies transformed into family? "I don't know," I finally whispered. "I don't know what I've seen." Pastor Kim smiled and placed his hand over my heart. "You have seen love, brother. You have seen what happens when heaven invades earth. You have seen the glory of God revealed to those who have eyes to see." And in that moment, something broke open inside me. All the carefully constructed walls of cynicism, all the protective barriers of skepticism, all the intellectual pride that had kept me safe from the possibility of faith, it all crumbled like sandcastles before a tide. I fell to my knees in that dirt square, surrounded by soldiers and villagers, monks and missionaries with angels standing guard around us all, and I wept. I wept for every miracle I had mocked, every believer I had ridiculed, every prayer I had dismissed. I wept for the empty years I had spent running from the God who had been pursuing me with relentless love. "I believe," I sobbed, the words torn from somewhere deeper than my throat. "God help me, I believe." Pastor Kim knelt beside me, his hand still on my heart. "Welcome home, brother," he whispered. "Welcome home." The sun was setting behind the mountains when the luminous beings began to depart. They didn't announce their leaving or make grand gestures. They simply began to rise one by one, their forms growing brighter as they ascended, until they merged with the golden light of the setting sun. The last to leave was the one who had spoken to Grace, and before he rose, he knelt before Pastor Kim. "Well done, faithful servant," he said. "The Father is pleased." Pastor Kim bowed deeply. "The glory is his alone." And then they were gone, leaving only the memory of their presence and the lingering sense that the very air around us had been sanctified by their touch. As night fell over Thantlang, the village was transformed. Where there had been fear, there was now joy. Where there had been division, there was unity. The military compound that had been established to monitor Christian activities had been converted into a medical station. The Buddhist monastery on the hill was welcoming Christian families for shared meals, and Colonel Thant, the man who had come to oversee Pastor Kim's execution, was sitting beside a small fire, reading from a Bible that one of the villagers had given him. I found myself sitting beside Sarah as she treated wounded soldiers and villagers with equal care. The medical supplies that had been brought to tend to the aftermath of the execution were now being used to heal the victims of years of conflict. "This isn't how these things usually end," I said to her, as I watched a young soldier helping an elderly Christian woman tend her garden by lantern light. Sarah looked up from the bandage she was wrapping around a monk's injured hand. "God's ways are not our ways, Marcus. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Sometimes he allows suffering to reveal his glory. Sometimes he intervenes to prevent it. But always he is working to draw people to himself." Over the following days, I remained in Thantlang to document what was happening. The changes were not temporary or superficial. They were deep, lasting transformations that affected every aspect of life in the village and the surrounding region. Colonel Thant submitted his resignation from the military and requested asylum at the village, asking to be baptized and to study under Pastor Kim. His example was followed by dozens of his subordinates. The regional commander, when he learned what had happened, initially ordered an investigation. But when he arrived in the village to assess the situation, he too was transformed by what he witnessed. The Buddhist monks who had participated in the persecution began a period of deep soul-searching. Many converted to Christianity outright, while others initiated unprecedented dialogues between Buddhist and Christian communities. The elderly monk, who had sought enlightenment for 60 years, became one of Pastor Kim's most devoted students, his questions and insights helping to bridge the gap between two very different spiritual traditions. But perhaps most remarkably, the children of the village, led by little Grace, began experiencing visions and supernatural encounters that drew believers from across Southeast Asia. Grace herself became known as the Little Prophet of Thantlang, and her drawings of future events proved to be uncannily accurate. But she remained a humble, joyful child, more interested in playing with her friends than in the attention her gifts brought. The story spread far beyond the mountains of Myanmar. My footage, when it was finally released, was viewed by millions around the world. Churches that had been in decline experienced revival. Missionaries reported unprecedented receptivity to the gospel in regions that had been previously closed, and government officials who had overseen religious persecution found themselves grappling with questions they had never considered. But for me, the most profound change was personal. The cynical documentary filmmaker who had traveled to Myanmar to expose religious fraud had been replaced by someone I barely recognized, a man of faith, a believer in miracles, a witness to the impossible. 3 months later, as I write this account, I am preparing to return to Thantlang for my baptism. Pastor Kim had suggested I wait, to be sure my decision was not based on emotion, but on genuine understanding. I have spent these months studying, praying, seeking to understand what I witnessed and what it means for my life. But there are some questions that cannot be answered through study alone. There are some truths that can only be received through faith. And there are some experiences that mark a person so deeply that they become the defining moment of their existence. What I witnessed in that mountain village was not simply a miraculous rescue or a dramatic conversion story. It was a revelation of the heart of God, His relentless love for humanity, His power to transform the most hardened hearts, His ability to bring good from the most evil intentions. I think often of Colonel Thant, now Brother Aung as he calls himself, a man who came to commit murder and found himself on his knees pleading for mercy. I think of the Buddhist monks who traded their quest for individual enlightenment for the joy of knowing a personal God. I think of the soldiers who laid down their weapons and picked up tools to serve those they had oppressed. But most of all, I think of Pastor Kim, hanging on that cross, praying for his executioners even as they nailed him to the wood. In that moment, I saw the clearest picture of Jesus Christ I had ever encountered, not in stained glass windows or religious art, but in the flesh and blood of a man who loved his enemies so completely that he was willing to die for them. And I think of the moment when the nails fell away, when the impossible became reality, when heaven invaded earth in a way that left no room for doubt or explanation. In that moment, every rational argument against the supernatural crumbled. Every intellectual barrier to faith was demolished. Every excuse for unbelief was stripped away. Friends, I know that what I'm telling you sounds impossible. I know that it challenges everything we think we know about how the world works. I know that it's easier to dismiss it as delusion or fabrication than to grapple with the implications of its truth. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. I recorded it with cameras that captured every impossible moment. And more than that, I felt it in my soul. The presence of the divine breaking into our world in ways that left me forever changed. The question is not whether these things happened. The evidence is overwhelming, documented, witnessed by hundreds of people from many different backgrounds and beliefs. The question is what you will do with this knowledge. Will you, like I did for so many years, retreat into the safety of skepticism? Will you build walls of rationalization to protect yourself from the possibility that God is real, that He loves you, that He has the power to transform your life in ways you cannot imagine? Or will you open your heart to the possibility that the same God who sent angels to protect His servant, who healed wounds that should have been fatal, who transformed enemies into family, might want to work a miracle in your life as well? Pastor Kim often says that the greatest miracle is not the healing of the body or the manifestation of angels. It's the transformation of the human heart. It's the moment when someone who has been running from God finally stops, turns around, and runs into His arms. That moment is available to you right now, wherever you are, whatever you've done, however far you think you've strayed from the path of righteousness. The same love that hung on a cross 2,000 years ago for the sins of the world is hanging on a cross today, waiting for you to accept it. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is available to raise you from whatever death you're experiencing. The death of broken relationships, the death of shattered dreams, the death of hope itself. The same mercy that forgave Colonel Thant, that welcomed former persecutors into the family of faith, is extended to you without condition or reservation. All you have to do is what I finally learned to do in that dirt square in Myanmar, surrounded by angels and enemies who had become brothers. Fall to your knees and say, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he died for my sins, that he rose from the dead, and that he offers eternal life to all who put their trust in him. I believe that miracles are not relics of ancient history, but ongoing expressions of God's love for his creation. I believe that the same God who intervened so dramatically in a small village in Myanmar is at work in your life right now, drawing you to himself through circumstances you might have dismissed as coincidence. I believe that this very moment, as you read or hear these words, is your personal invitation to experience the miracle of new birth, the transformation that comes when heaven invades earth in the sanctuary of your own heart. Don't wait for angels to appear or for dramatic supernatural manifestations. They might come, but they're not necessary. The greatest miracle happens in the quiet moment when you whisper, Jesus, I need you. Forgive me. Change me. Make me new. I'm praying for you right now, whoever you are, wherever you are. I'm praying that you will have the courage to take that step of faith, to move beyond doubt into the realm of belief, to experience for yourself the love that hung on a cross for you. The nails have already fallen away. The tomb is already empty. The angels are already singing your name. All that remains is for you to say yes. Will you?